Tonight with us have four wonderful panel with us this evening. Panelists, sorry, with us this evening. They will be sharing and discussing about visibility, discrimination, and religion in religious spaces, and share with us how they have been navigating those spaces and have been doing the work that they have been doing to bring about equality. So, without any further ado, we will be having Miss Cameron D. Anderson Harry as our moderator this evening, and I will hand it over to Miss Cameron to just introduce herself to us, and she'll introduce the other panelists as we go. Yeah.
Thank you, Daniel. Hello, family. It's Family Day. Happy Equality Family Day to everyone, and very excited to be with you on today. For some that may not know me, I am Elder or Reverend Carmarian D. Anderson Harvey. My pronoun series is the she form. That's why I have blush and lipstick on for my appearance for you today. But I'm so excited. Let me just give a little backdrop. One, they wanted me to share kind of, what I do in my country, in the States. I do work for the National Office of the Human Rights Campaign, and I am a senior leader. I'm the state director for a southern state in Alabama. But for the sake of this conversation, I am clergy. I am clergy with a national denomination or reformation that centers LGBTQ plus and other marginalized, called the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries. I serve as the national officer, the national minister for our transgender population, which is called Trans Saints, and that's in the States and also global. In addition to that, I also am a member of discernment with the United Church of Christ, where I will develop more of ministry under their denomination guidance and leadership. And there's other things. I'm a Black woman with trans experience. I'm excited to live out my truth, my purpose. I'm embarking 30 years, so I'm no stranger to our community, nor in a leadership role of being someone who's trans-identified. I am a mother, and I'm a grandmother of 3. So that's just a little bit about me. But today is about really the conversation that we'll be having around faith, family, and gender. The one disclaimer that I will make anytime we're talking about religious faith or settings is that we understand that not everyone comes from the faith background. Hence the reason why we make this very inclusive, but not exclusive. Additionally, we understand that some religious provide hurt and trauma, and it is not our goal this evening to resurface that. Our main goal is to have dialogue from our narrative and also our expertise walking in between what we call the intersectional between our family, our gender, our narrative, and faith. And so we will open up for questions and comments towards the end. These are generally in our I statements, but more importantly, also things that we have seen in holding on. And that's a key word for this evening, holding on to our faith when most do not think we should have a faith. And I dare them. Because I think our faith is who we are. It is our culture. If you believe in subscribing or not, there is something, even if you are your faith, there is something that we believe in, and we want to be able to acknowledge and affirm through this conversation. No right or wrong in our responses, more or less for dialogue. Now, that was my professional side. We met yesterday. Listen, this is going to be a couch conversation. We're going to get real. We may say some direct things. We may call out some experiences that we've had to see if you resonate with them. But more importantly, we want to also offer some tools that we have gained that might be consideration to the audience on this evening. So no further ado, I want to invite the panelists to join me, and they will share who they are to you. And I'm going to start with Reverend Angeline C. Jackson, and her pronouns is she and her. If you can join me and let the people know who you are.
Hey, Marianne, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, good night, good evening. I think that might be the coverage of the time zones that we might see. And good morning, wherever you are, depending on when you watch this again. So I'm Angeline C. Jackson. I will be ordained on June 1, but at this point, Reverend works for the titles. I am a Unitarian Universalist minister, and I am the author of the book Funny Girl, My Fight Against Homophobia in Jamaica. I am Jamaican. I recently moved to the US in December, so I still consider myself Jamaican and connected to the issues and experiences of Jamaican LGBTQ people. And with that, that will be my very brief intro, and the rest will come out in the discussion and any questions that may come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angeline. And I'd like to bring in Muhammad Amin, pronouns he, they.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mohammed Q. Amin. I am an Indo-Caribbean queer immigrant Muslim organizer based in New York City. A lot of my work is centered around uplifting Caribbean LGBTQ voices. I am also the founder of the Caribbean Equality Project, and we are a community organization that advocates for Afro and Indo-Caribbean LGBTQ people in New York City through public education, community organizing, civic engagement, storytelling, and cultural and social programming. The organization focuses on advocacy for LGBTQ immigrants' rights, gender equity, racial justice, immigration, mental health services, and ending hate violence in the Caribbean diaspora.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. Appreciate that. And our last but not least panelist is Yakub J.M. Nestor. I'd like to invite Yakub using the pronouns he, him.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Yakub Nestor. I'm from St. Lucia. I am currently currently sitting on the United Nations Youth Advisory Group, and I am also the chair for the USAID Regional Youth Council, past CARICOM Youth Ambassador. A lot of my work has been dealing with youth, particularly minority groups and marginalized youth. Have done a lot of work with the differently abled community as well. And I am an educator. I have done all levels in education, from early childhood all the way to tertiary, youth as far as university. And I hold anything that fosters conversation dear to my heart, because I like ruffling feathers, because it allows you to educate whilst learning at the same time. So thank you so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to this discussion.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And I see folks have already start putting where they are located in the chat. If you would like to participate in that, please drop where you are viewing from. We'll love for you to participate in the intro, but through the chat feature. So as we begin, we're going to have a series of few questions just so we can dialogue. And again, panelists, listen, I'm not writing you a check, okay? So, you can be as scripted as you would like. That will help the audience, based off, your narrative. But for context purposes, like myself, I am a Christian. I now subscribe to interfaith. I was reared Pentecostal. I now adopt neo-Pentecostal. I took the good and left the bad, and I have developed as a trans theologian to duplicate the good of resurrection and celebration versus the hell brimstone. That's my context. Interfaith wise is very interesting because I love to learn from other faith. I have found there are some similarities and there are also some differences. In doing the work around inclusion and equality, I'm finding that there are some similarities in some rejection and discrimination. Okay. And so let's kind of unpack that a little bit. Let's get our audience familiar with who you are as it relates to telling us about your religious background or faith background and your current faith practice. And if I may start with Muhammad and then kick it over to Yakub and then Angeline.
Thanks so much. So I want to start by saying a lot of the work that I do in New York City is to create safety. I was born in Guyana and I was raised in a very traditional Muslim household. And I didn't necessarily know how religion was going to influence my life back then. And as I got older and I really started to struggle with my sexuality, struggled with my same-sex attraction, struggled with all of these thoughts that I was having, I developed a lot of emotional challenges. I became really depressed as a teenager, and I didn't necessarily know how to process what I was feeling, what I was experiencing. And I also couldn't talk to my parents about this because I wasn't out, and I wasn't comfortable at the time coming out. Because to be frank, I hadn't come out to myself yet. I hadn't verbalized the words that to affirm who I am today. And Islam played a critical role in my life. My family went to the mosque every Friday. We would often go to like Jummah prayers. All of the religious holidays, Eid were like a really big holidays for us in Guyana. And I spent a lot of time being in this traditional setting. And migrating to the US, I found myself in the same setting, different country, different city, same family background, same family values, same family structures. And as a teenager, I stepped away from my faith because at one point I learned that who I am was actually an abomination and was actually a sin.
Mm.
And that really forced me to question how I identify with Islam. And did I have to choose my faith or do I have to choose how I love myself first? And now that I'm in my 40s, a lot of the work that I do is to reclaim my faith, but to also create space for LGBTQ Muslim folks. In 2017, I co-founded what is now known the LGBTQ community Iftar in New York City. And during the month of Ramadan, Iftar is a period where Muslims gather and celebrate. And for many queer Muslims, this is not necessarily always the case. And this particular event was started in 2017 in response to the Trump Muslim ban on 7 Muslim countries. And in New York, it really impacted us because queer Muslims already didn't have a space to go. And now we were resisting this Muslim ban that were impacting primarily Black Muslims coming from parts of Africa. And today we have this earlier this year, we hosted our 8th annual LGBTQ community iftar at the center, and over 150 plus community members joined us. And today the space has transformed into this multicultural experience where we share food through and culture and experience gender neutral prayers. In Islam, men and women, the religion itself doesn't necessarily identify non-binary people, but there is this separation in how you pray. And at our LGBTQ iftar, all genders, everyone pray together. There's no anyone of any gender could lead the prayer in itself, and has been really a healing space. In a lot of ways, the LGBTQ iftar healed a part of me that was really broken as a child, and has really affirmed just who I am today, and to really just own that I'm a queer Muslim person and I can own that without dealing with any sort of traditional backlash from traditional Muslims.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for sharing that story. You mentioned something, you reclaimed your faith. And I want to unpack that. You gave a key word. It was difficult for you to talk about, your sexual orientation or how you identify against the social norms to your parents or maybe even close loved ones because you did not reconcile with yourself first. And I want to just lift that up because oftentimes this is not a battle between us. Okay. And so I want to get that once you realize that this is your truth and this is ordained, this is not an abomination, it does allow you to become free and liberated to be self-identified intersectionally. And what we heard is that you reclaim your faith. And I must also say you reclaimed your age because you do not look in your 40s. Okay. All righty. All right. Let me go to Yakub. If you can share with us, your religious and background and current faith practice.
Good evening once again, everyone. So I'm a Rastafarian. I grew up in a Rastafarian household. My parents are very firm in the belief of Rastafarianism, I would say. Um, as a child growing up, I didn't get to make the decision of what religion I wanted to partake in. Growing up in a Rastafarian household is very different from raising up in a faith-based household, I would say, because Rastafarianism doesn't really have a building they go to every time for worship or anything of that sort. Rastafarianism is really about spirituality, and it's about the hair. The lock symbolizes your Rastafarian, but also the way that the practicality of your living standards. So how do you live and how do you practice what the Bible states? So for me, it was a lot of pressure because as a child, I was very feminine as a child. So imagine you have two very firm Rastafarian parents, and you have this young child who already has long hair, who looks very feminine and acts like a girl. So my parents tried to be more firm within the teachings of Rastafarianism because originally Rastafarianism, if we have to backtrack, it really came from Jamaica, and Jamaica is kind of known to be, where a lot of stigma and discrimination happens. But when you look at Rastafarianism from a cultural and historical concept, it started with really Marcus Garvey from Jamaica, who was really a great political figure. And he made a very famous proclamation once. If you look to Africa, when a black king shall be crowned, for the day of deliverance is at hand. And that was a statement. A lot of Rastafarians at the time viewed as very prophetic, because if we remember Emperor Haile Selassie the First of Ethiopia, when he was crowned in 1930, his name was, Rastafari Makunen. And a lot of Rastafarians at that time saw it as a fulfillment of that prophecy because he really became the god of the Rastafarian culture. Because most Rastafarians do refer to Haile Selassie as God or Jah because he's the living version. In our faith, I would say we take a lot on the Bible, but not in the way of the Western culture. We interpret it for what it is spiritually. What does every line dictate us to do? We're not taking bits and pieces, but as a Rastafarian, you're trying to build your spirituality. It's almost like Rastafarianism has a connection with the Muslim culture. It's very closely tied to the Muslim culture in itself, where they take the Bible for what it literally means, but it's not literally in the sense of the focal and the storytelling, like most people would say, but the spiritual concept of how you grow yourself spiritually as an individual. Um, and Rastafarianism embraces the notion of Zion. And when you think of Zion, Zion is really considered the Garden of Eden. And a lot of people would tell you the Garden of Eden is Africa, because Africa has mostly every animal species, most animal species in the world. And when you look at Babylon, Babylon is really and truly how Rastafarians view the Western world, oppressive views on the faith, etc. But growing up as a Rastafarian, weird enough, there are key things that make you kind of a Rastafarian, I would say, because of the lifestyle. So like the ITIL lifestyle, where you look at the natural living and purity. As a Rastafarian, you really have to follow like a vegetarian diet, and you abstain from alcohol, processed foods, and any artificial substance, that could so-called corrupt your body or mind. Our dreadlocks for sure is a symbolization of what we call the Lion of Judah, because for us, it really and truly represents our strength, our freedom, and we're very proud of our African heritage. Because if you look at it, we also connected to the Bible in the Nazarene, who the Nazarene was really and truly God, but we call it the Nazarite, which is a vow that was mentioned in the Bible. And that vow states that we live a life really devoted to God. Ganja for sure, as we call it, marijuana, maybe Jane.
Burnt
Um,
offering, burnt offering. Yes.
that's right, Fred. That's the key thing for us because we look at it as being very sacramental. Because what it helps us do as Rastafarians, it helps aid us in spiritual insight and our connection with Jah God. And we use it when we do rituals or reasoning and deepen meditation and fellowship because it helps Strange enough, a lot of people don't believe it, but marijuana helps open up your mind and your conscious. I actually smoke before every single exam, and I've never failed an exam. And I've been practicing that from childhood. I never lost weight or anything. It's based on how you take in the herb. And then Rastafarian also looks at repatriation and unity because because it started with Marcus Garvey, there's this huge notion that Rastafarians need to be repatriated to Africa. And it's not really looking at it from the physical context of us going there physically, but mentally and spiritually aligning yourself to Africa and promoting the views of Africa because it's a very heavily oppressed nation, and a lot of our spiritual form comes from there. So for me, I actually only recently told my mom I was gay, and my mother was like, I knew, I was aware, you didn't have to tell me. But I waited until my dad was dead to tell her because my father was more ingrained in the faith than she was. She came and met my father as a Rastafarian. And my father was very firm in his teachings. He was this type of old school guy where he enforced the belief on his children. So I raised up in a home where every night we prayed, we said Psalms. So I had to learn every Psalms as a child by heart because my father believed that, you're not fighting a physical warfare, you're fighting spiritual warfare every day. And I've kept that with me because literally in this day and age, there's no way anybody can tell me I'm fighting a physical warfare. We're really fighting with forces that transcends the physical body. So that's it for me. I don't want to go too much into it. Thank you.
No, thank you. And you gave us history as well. So I appreciate that. I'm going to pull out something that you said. One of the things is a lot of us, when we're being reared in our homes by our families, sometimes we can't choose what that faith or religious background is. And we're forced to be in something. And what I also hear is that because you didn't have a choice, how you have still been able to embrace it. Okay, because you used a word, and it's a magical word, regardless if you're doing, I call it burnt offering. I saw my friend in the chat say yes, but I believe it's a form of consciousness. And I also think that there's a form of consciousness in sexual orientation, gender identity to help us make the best conscious choice for us. Okay. And the final piece is how the fear of when we are in position to out ourselves to our, parents, guardians, whomever, like you use an example, your mom already knew. I think so many of us may have that same storyline. At least I've heard it. My parents were the same. My mother was the same way. It was a dad I had an issue with because of the devout of his position. That leads me to finally the fear of what others think others will say that produced a level of rejection to a loved one. I know that was a lot. Let me unpack that. Often, yes, it's cultural. We don't wish you to do this. We preach this against our culture. But oftentimes, from a mental health or brain health perspective, it's about what are folks going to say about us if we allow you to do this? Okay, so I want to just mention, I'm just bringing things out because these are common things I know that I've heard, maybe you guys have heard as well, some of our panelists. All right, Reverend Angeline, give us your background and your current faith practice, and then we're going to go lightning round so we can make sure we get to as much dialogue as possible.
All right. So I grew up Brethren. I grew up Christian. I grew up in a Brethren church. My dad was and still is an elder in the church. My mom has served in multiple roles in the church, from Sunday school superintendent to finally being one of the first women commissioned as deacons in the church. And that recently happened, like in the last 4 years. Just like you, Yakub, I grew up in that space where church was it. There was no choice to not do this. This was what life was. And I accepted that space. My distraction. What am I trying to say? Grew up in the faith. And so I was baptized at around 7. And that was unheard of in our religious community. That was largely because I responded to an altar call and said, this is what I want to do. And it took some years. It took at least a year of conversation, of working through what that meant, what it meant to have somebody as young as 7 being baptized, and to have somebody else outside of the church do it because my dad could not. And so but life was church. Church was Sundays. There were, Bible study on Wednesday and youth group on Friday, and then there were other items in the week. On Saturdays was track distribution, and I enjoyed that space. I enjoyed being in the environment of church, and that meant a lot to me in that time.
Mhm.
As I got older, I started to realize that I think I like girls. And that first time of that experience, I was young, somewhere between 7 and 9, and kissed a girl during hide and seek. And just that fear of, wait, what did I just do? And starting to struggle through that. But then the space of how I grew up was weird because I don't recall hearing in church at any point in time when I was younger anybody speaking about LGBT issues. I
Mhm.
knew culturally it was an issue
Mhm.
because the dancehall songs and the reggae songs, and I heard that. But at church and in my home, it was never something I heard. For me, my experience and what I knew was that God is love, and that has been the base of everything that I've operated from. My parents were very integral in my life, and so as I grew through life, I'm realizing I'm a lesbian. I get to 13, 14, I come out to my mom the first time and we pray about it, and that was the end of the conversation. That's a much longer story, which we don't have time for today, but that was kind of the what that first reaction was. And then later in my life, at around 16, when I really realized this is who I am, I actually stepped back from church. I stepped back from taking communion because for me, I did not feel that I was on one accord. I was not in one accord with the believers.
Mhm.
And so how how could I sit in communion with others, taking this bread, taking this wine, and we're not on the same page? Um, and that ultimately led to I went back into fellowship because I still hadn't told. This is the in-between space of when I first told my mom and the second time the coming out happened, but I was not ready to tell them. And so I found a way to get back into church for communion, sometimes deliberately finding excuses to miss church. But I was around 17 when my girlfriend at the time, her mom outed me. She
Mhm.
was mad to come to school to give me an ass whooping. And my own mom found out about it. And that triggered a big conversation. I ended up going to therapy, which I now know was XK therapy. I did not recognize it at the time.
Mhm.
Um, and solidly that move away from from communion, because then I had to send a letter to the elders to say why I was no longer participating in communion and things like that. And so that was that experience right there. And then over the years, I did therapy for a couple months. Then eventually I said I'm not doing it. I told my parents it was a waste of money and time. I didn't like what was being said. I didn't agree with what was being said. Um, Jumping forward a bit, I kind of meandered through various religious practices, science of mind, metaphysics, um, agnostic atheism for a bit, finding my way to Metropolitan Community Church, and really starting to reconnect to God in that way
Mhm.
through the MCC community. But it wasn't quite right. And at that point, I started feeling again that call to ministry because I'd always had that particular call. Um, Eventually, I was introduced to Unitarian Universalism. And the first time I engaged it, I thought, this is it. This is the space that I need to be in. Because for me, Unitarian Universalism is a bowl, it's a container that
Mhm.
that I have put into the things that make sense to me theologically. but I also take out the things that don't quite fit in the theological space that I am right now. And during seminary, one of the big things that happened was when I realized I needed to deconstruct my faith. And so I spent the whole of seminary going through this process of recognizing that because my parents were so integral to my life, integral to my early Christianity, that for in some ways the two were conflated. God and my parents had gotten conflated along the way, and needing to spend that time to break it out. Because now here I was with my parents not supporting who I am as an LGBT, as a lesbian, but also that struggle with knowing that God is love and God loves me. And so kind of finding the ways to work through that tension. But here I am in Unitarian Universalism, which for me is it is a welcoming and affirming community. I can be my whole self. I can bring not just my lesbian self, not just my Christian self. I can bring all the pieces together in this space, and to practice, to find spiritual practices that sustain me. And sometimes those practices change, but always being able to know that I can move with that. And the beauty of Unitarian Universalism is being able to continuously change. It's not an arrived space. I don't reach to a final point with my faith. I'm always in the opportunity to explore, to navigate, to renegotiate religion and faith and different words and how those impact and are present in my life. So I'll stop with that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And this was our big impactful question, because it was important to hear. Storytelling is so important. It's almost like in my faith, we call a testimony, because some folks may be able to resonate. One of the things I appreciate about your story, taking us through your journey, is a couple things that you kept what worked for you and what made sense to you and what you love. And you took out of your bowl that did not make sense theologically. And I think that's important for the audience to understand, that we do have the ability to pick and choose, what we want to accept and what we do not want to accept, even as it relates to our faith and faith backgrounds. The other piece that I appreciate is you just offered us that there is a place that you can possibly find, may not be in your backyard, but since COVID, everybody is online, okay? So there are options of, various faiths, pretty much the faiths that we're speaking about today, that's there. You use the word ass. I want to define the word ass. That's a donkey, y'all, okay? Just so y'all know, that's a donkey. But more importantly, you hit on something, which is ex-gay therapy, okay? Ex-gay therapy, which is also conversion therapy. And it does not work. You cannot fix or correct what is honest and true, period. Honest and true. And then finally, deconstructing our faith. Everything that was a learned behavior to us, how school took you that route, but some of us, and I had the same experience in school, but some don't go to school. And I remember how important it was for people to say, then find your own way of creating your own school, reading for yourself, interpret for yourself, live what you interpret out, and you will be surprised at what type of feeling you will receive than the different feeling that you were forced to receive. So I wanted to unpack that. And I see someone in the chat, you mentioned Metropolitan Community Churches. Someone up in Canada is excited about you mentioning that particular denomination, which is the first and oldest LGBTQ plus denomination by Reverend Troy. So let's jump in. Let's jump in. Let's see, where do I want to start? Because wow, that was a lot. In your religious institution, what are some of the ways that you are promoting inclusion? I think Muhammad mentioned to us about what they created, for LGBTQ plus or queer Muslims. So I'm a backtrack and go to Yaqub and then Angeline, and then we'll come back to you, Muhammad, if you want to add anything to that. But what are you doing? And maybe others like myself, or that may not be on the webinar, who is centering on the front line to change the trajectory of faith to be more inclusive to sexual orientation, gender identity, and as I like to say, anything that is marginalized that they want to call sin, which is really not, because we were all created wonderfully made and acceptable. Okay. So Yakub, talk to us a little bit. How do you have the conversations with others in your faith, or what have you done to promote inclusion in your faith that you mentioned to us?
So, firstly, that's very tough to do with this faith, and I will tell you why.
Okay.
Because Rastafarians hold the very conservative view when it comes to sexual orientation and gender roles. They hold it in line basically with what the Bible depicts. But most of all, when it comes to the Caribbean, it's almost like a culture. Because when you look at gender and when you look at sexual orientation, it's really and truly influenced by what I would say human beings have interpreted from the Bible, their personal beliefs, and then we go about preaching such. But a lot of Rastafarians believe in heterosexuality because they look at it as the only natural and only acceptable form of a human relationship. And strict gender roles are really upheld, within the community. So there's a lot of discrimination against LGBTQI people, but then what you find as well is, as much as I might want to go in and I might want to change the views themselves are always challenged by the younger generation. And what I mean by that, in today's world, especially in the Rastafarian community, I can even step out of it, is that as a child, we are being exposed to so many things now that views and cultural norms don't hold us to those barriers anymore. We're not fish in any jar, any container anymore. We're sharks and we want what we want. When we smell blood, we go for it. So just like me, I knew I was gay from the age of 5. When I saw boys, I was like, damn, that boy is very nice, see? And as I started growing older, I was like, oh, mate, cute. I like to see that boy. I like to see that man. But then, as a Rastafarian, you need to understand our parents, particularly our fathers, are so indoctrined in their faith that sometimes they forget they have children, that it's a child you're raising. And all a child wants is for you to love them as a child, as not only as a child, but as your child.
Yeah.
So the affection that a child does not get from you, particularly as an LGBTQI youth, they may seek it out elsewhere. And that is what I did.
Okay.
And a lot of others did as well. Because your father didn't love you. So a guy who comes out gay to you or comes onto you and you don't even know if it's a predator or not, likes you, you take the initiative and you're like, he likes me. There's this connection. You're not looking at them in a fatherly figure, but you're looking at them as somebody you can relate to because you have the same feelings and emotions as them. And sometimes that brings about a problem in the community. But then you also have to remember Rastafarianism is kind of tied to reggae. So I don't know if most of you know like Buju Banton, Boom Bye Bye, a lot of those songs. But if you look at it as well, when you look at reggae music, a lot of reggae music promotes, heterosexuality and fire burn on the LGBTQI initiative. But then when you look at it, some of the work that I would have done is more instilling sensitization as to your rights as a young person. I don't believe in forcing my views on any young person. I just sensitize them because at the end of the day, I always believe in spoon feeding people. Because for a child to like something, you need to spoon feed them, or for a child to get the taste of something. And I'm very open with my sexuality because I've always been comfortable with my sexuality. I always tell people, these hands are blessed. These hands can fight, so I'm good for myself. Others are not like that, right? So in the community, when we had Naya Bingi and those things, I used to question the children and stuff, and I realized we had quite a huge population, but they were hidden because we knew how our parents was, and we didn't want to be shunned. Being shunned from the Rastafarian faith, it's not as easy as being shunned from the Christian faith. When you're shunned, most times you don't get to go back to your family, period. But it's worse than that. It's almost you feel like there's this disconnection with God. They make you feel like God doesn't appreciate you and God doesn't love you. So there's this cutting point of your there's this cutoff point of when it comes to your spiritual purpose. The other thing as well is, you know, in Rastafarianism, we preach about the conscious human. But then if you're preaching about us being conscious, why not when we're actually asking the conscious questions of, hey, I like a guy, I understand this is in the Bible, but then remember the Bible was written by men, and the Bible is not even 50%, you know, translated. It's just a little bit that translated. Do you think that we're taking some of the things into a wrong narrative? And my favorite story to always bring up when I do discussions is Sodom and Gomorrah, because a lot of preach pastors and churches will bring up Sodom and Gomorrah and it was destroyed because of gay people. And I'm like, if you read the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the only thing it says that the smell of sin, it didn't specify what sin. All it said that the smell of sin was so heavy that God was really was upset about it. It really didn't depict you know, the LGBTQI agenda, etc. And then the other thing as well, as a Rastafarian, Rastafarians love history and culture. So I always used to tie it in. When you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics, you notice they would give pharaohs, they would give kings. When you look at Haile Selassie, his lineage as some people, you know, who did partake in, you know, the LGBTQI initiative as well. And there was a strange thing I had a discussion with my father about. I remember talking to my father and he said, you know, he doesn't discriminate. As a Rastafarian, if you're a true Rastafarian, you don't ever discriminate about against anybody's physical sexual preference, because it's a spirituality that makes the person really and truly who they are. And as a Rastafarian, you need to understand that when the body dies, the soul still lives, the soul still exists, and there might be a purpose for reincarnation. So it's as long as a Rastafarian, you're connected to God through your faith, that's fine and dandy. What you do in your bedroom is not anybody's business. And for me, it really opened up my eyes that as much as elders in the Rastafarian community would preach, you know, and stuff, I I look at it from the point that you don't get a lot of discrimination in the Rastafarian community if you really look at it from an honest perspective. They more uphold you, they try to more stick to the spiritual notion of what or how you go about spiritually dealing with people. But when it comes to the physical sense, I mean, they will turn a blind eye to it because at the end of the day, you're still one of them. They don't really shun you in that sense. So, and then the other thing as well, we don't have much of a huge there is not really a huge limit a huge community, a Rastafarian community in St. Lucia, particularly amongst young people, because it's you know, it's fading out. It's dying. Rastafarianism is dying. Rastafarianism has become like a norm. People just put locks on their heads. So it's not like it's a culture now. Thanks. Thank you,
Thank you.
Bennett.
Yeah, let me so because I'm looking at the time and I want to be mindful that we
Yeah.
open up for questions. So I'm gonna switch a question on you, Angeline, if you don't mind, okay? And I know you can do this very succinctly from the story you told us at first. But why are allies, our co-conspirators, they're, you know, we call them either or, but why are they why are within faith communities? Let me add that. Allies and co-conspirators within faith community. Why is it so important to the LGBTQ plus community? You know, why is
Yeah.
that love of support? Even if we're not there yet, or even if
Yeah.
we are there, why is it important?
It's important to have allies in our communities because because we can't do all the work. The LGBTQ community cannot do all the work in our faith communities because that is a space, it's a space that is fraught with so much hurt and pain in some ways, and the emotional labor that needs to go into creating a community that is affirming and welcoming to LGBTQ people is not work that we can always do all the time. And that space that comes from the support of allies is important. The United Methodists just proved that the other day. The vote that they just made
Yes.
to rescind prohibitions about LGBT clergy did not happen just because LGBTQ United Methodists were advocating and present in that space. It happened because that they build those alliances and allies who are willing to participate and support in that work. So
thank you so much for that. Mohammed, I want to and the reason I'm giving you this question, and Angeline, you can also pop in as well. I think from the seminary background, which we also learn counseling skills when having these types of conversation. We call it pastoral care at times. But I want to offer Mohammed, because you gave a storyline of things that you had created, in order to hold on to your faith. How can members of the LGBTQ plus and queer community cope with the trauma of feeling rejected by their religion or faith? How did you cope before even starting? Or what recommendations would you have if anyone is feeling traumatized because of that love of rejection in faith? Not family, but sometimes that's subjective, because the family, we teach that the family in the household is the same family in your faith as well.
Yeah, great question. I want to start by saying I first learned how to hate myself from my country. I didn't learn how to hate myself from my faith. I didn't learn it from my family. I learned it from being Guyanese, the community that I was raised in, the laws of the country, these anti-LGBTQ laws that the Caribbean itself has inherited from our colonizers that we're still recovering from. Like, that's how I first learned how to hate myself. And it was who I knew I was, and the fact that I was questioning that. In society, I've always heard that these terms like anti-LGBTQ cultural hate speech, right? I don't necessarily want to repeat them, but we've heard them many times. But this language of hate that still exists in our Caribbean and here in the diaspora, I always say that when we migrated, we also transplanted our hate. And we see that a lot in the diaspora as well, even in the community that I live in. One of the things that I've done is I've had to really unpack and, as Angeline said earlier, like deconstruct and separate faith from your culture, from your family, from your identity. Um, and over the years, I've had to put them all back together because I've also realized that all of these identity can live harmoniously and they're not mutually exclusive. They inform who we are, they inform how the world experiences us and how we experience the world. One of the things that was really impactful in my life was in 2016, the Pulse nightclub shooting that took place in Orlando. Um, a Muslim person killed 49 people. And within our own LGBTQ community in New York and throughout the US, Islamophobia became a thing again within the LGBTQ community. And I first experienced Islamophobia as a teenager when I started college, and that was 9/11. And after 9/11, I also had to reconcile with being queer and being Muslim, being brown in America, and being racially profiled by the NYPD. And I remember coming home one day and I was just stopped by the NYPD. And I had a hat on. It was like a little kufi, but it wasn't a traditional Muslim hat. And I was coming from an event and I was just pulled over. And I was just grabbed and I was just asked all these questions. And the reason that happened to me was because I had on traditional Indian attire. And the fact that I presented Muslim, it actually warranted this racial profiling that took place. And a lot of people still experience that today. We see a resurgence of this type of racial profiling in New York right now. So that was when I first had to encounter Islamophobia, but also homophobia at the same time, being queer and Muslim. But in 2016, I was really frustrated with our LGBTQ community in the US and in New York in particular, where we talk about, celebrating marriage equality just a year before, national marriage equality. And for so many immigrants and people of color, like marriage equality was never our fight, right? It was about, we know whose fight it was. But our fight as people of color, many of us was trying to find safe housing. We're trying to find healthcare. We're trying to find gender affirming care. We're trying to maintain economic sustainability, but also wrestle with our faith. And I was one of those individuals. And I started to speak out in New York against my own community. Like, how can we celebrate love if we're also promoting hate?
Yeah.
Because within our own LGBT community, we have to recognize that. Um, and I know in the interest of time, I also want to say that religion is something that was transplanted to the Caribbean, particularly through the transatlantic slave trade and indentureship. Um, our religion, the religion that we know now and that we are fighting with, right, has been reimagined into something that they want us to believe it is. And Islam was brought to the Caribbean from enslaved Africans from particularly West Africa to the Caribbean. Islam was also brought to the Caribbean from Indians from India through indentureship and has been cultivated throughout the Caribbean in itself and has also been transplanted here to New York City as well through the double migration process. But counseling and I Caribbean Equality Project has a support group specifically for Caribbean LGBTQ immigrants in New York City. And over the last 9 years, hundreds of our community members have shared stories about how they wrestle with their faith. But therapy is something that they often don't talk about. Trauma-informed therapy, just accessing counseling in itself. And that's also because we don't normalize mental health care in the Caribbean. And even here in Richmond Hill, where I live, mental health is not something that is readily accessible. So as an organization, Caribbean Equality Project had to create this space, had to work with culturally competent mental health counselors to create this resource for our community. And through that process, folks were able to unpack generational trauma, physical violence, emotional violence that they've experienced because of who they are, but also talk about their faith. And while some folks have reconnected, reclaimed, and reimagined what their faith could look like, spaces like the annual LGBTQ community iftar in New York allows our community to be safe, to be seen, and be celebrated. And when we talk about the intersectionality of what it means to be LGBTQ and how do we think about faith? The whole goal of all of that is to know that you're safe. However you practice, however you celebrate your faith and whatever that looks like, the goal of it is to be safe, but also doing it with love as well.
Thank you for sharing that. And, this question is very touching. And, I often like to say to my siblings in the LGBTQ plus community is this trauma is real. And, a couple things that I will say is one, you have to name that hurt. Okay. You can't keep it in. Name it in the atmosphere, name it however, you're most comfortable. But you mentioned that there are some startup, support groups, whether that's in person in your country or online. And I want to continue saying that because we do live in this technology world. And I know technology is not fully accessible to everybody in their country. But there are also social networks. Have we identified others who affirm us and that can heal us, in that place? And then you got ECADE, who is a hub that can then try to assist to refer, if you so need that level of support. So thank you for sharing that. When it comes down to coping with trauma, though, the challenge is because the religion or the faith practice has done some harm. Okay. And so the question I want to ask Angelique is, what does it mean to do no harm in religious and faith backgrounds? And I think that this is not subjective. This is almost like common sense. What does it mean to do no harm? Example, just to contextualize, okay? I am not going to go drive 100 miles an hour, whatever the speed zone, and I'm going to drive comfortably so I won't get in a wreck, especially when I have my children and grandchildren in the car. Otherwise, I'm putting them in harm's way and including myself, okay? I'm not going to sit up here and drink some poison for me to get sick. That's absurd. We are taught better than that. But in religious and faith spaces, they've had bad behavior. in promoting harm. But what does it mean to do no harm in order for us, LGBTQ plus individuals and other members, to feel safe?
I think I hear what you say, but I also think it's subjective. And I'm gonna throw something here,
Okay.
which is that, and I disagree with it, but a lot of Christians will say, love the sinner and hate the sin. And that comes out in many different
Love
ways
the
for people.
sinner.
Love
Hate
the
the sin,
sinner,
yeah.
love the sinner, hate the
Mhm.
sin. And that
Yes.
comes out in many different ways. I hate it as a statement.
Mhm.
But when I can get a Christian to get to that point in a conversation, it's a win. If they're coming from a very anti-LGBT stance, and I can get to a conversation point with them where that is the next thing they say, it is a middle of it is the edge of the middle of the road to get somewhere. It's not
Mhm.
it's not the statement we want. That's not what I'm saying. It's not the statement we want. I remember when my godmother finally got to a point of conversation with me where she said, I don't agree with your lifestyle. Listen, I didn't like the conversation. I don't agree with your lifestyle, but you're my goddaughter and I wouldn't want to see harm come to you. That for me was a win. And then it comes to the conversation of what do you mean when you say you don't want to see me when you don't want me to be harmed? When you say love the sinner, what does that actually mean? Because you cannot have anti-LGBTQ policies and say that you are still loving the individual. So it's getting to that point. So for me, do no harm is the organization I had in the past that I co-founded was called Quality of Citizenship Jamaica. The purpose of that organization, the a big part of that conversation was that as LGBTQ people, we are citizens, we are residents, we are people in society and deserve to have the same quality of life. We deserve to be treated as citizens, not second class to anything else, right? And so do no harm is a space of what for somebody, whatever the theological stance is, how can I recognize that you are a human being?
Yeah.
And how can I say that I want to affirm who you are as a person, regardless of whatever else theologically is going on, right? It's not a perfect place. And I think that sometimes I've gotten to the point in my own life where there's no perfect answer. The ideal answer is you love the person, full stop. But until we can get there, it is a space of incrementally getting to the point that we need to be at. So in Unitarian Universalism, we have at this point I as a UU have 8 principles that guide how I live and behave in the world. And as Unitarian Universalists broadly, there are 7 principles. And the first principle of Unitarian Universalism is recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person. That's it. There's nothing else. There's no qualification. There's nothing else to it. It is who are you as an individual, what your worth and your dignity, and recognizing that. And if every person of faith, if every religious community could come to that point of the inherent worth and dignity of every person, we get to the point of doing no harm to LGBTQ people.
Wow, thank you. And thank you for defining subjective, because, you know, oftentimes for people like us who've done this work for a while, to me, it's just common sense about doing no harm. But you're absolutely right. They will use whatever they will like to justify that they are loving. But in essence, that to me, that's a cover up, and that is still promoting rejection. And you're right. That first principle that I have is love your neighbor as yourself. And when you love, and this is more from a Christian standpoint, or for those that use, you know, that type of writing, but if you do that, then you are a disciple. Whether that's, you know, Christ, if you believe in Christ, the great teacher, which is, you know, in our Muslim, Islamic, but that is in, you know, the scriptures. If you show love and do no harm, it proves to you that you are a disciple of the great voice. How about that? Okay. So listen, I've gotten permission to go a little bit just about 15 minutes because we want to open it up to the audience. I got one more question, then we're going to run over to the audience and see what they have to say to y'all, and then we'll give it back over to ECADE for them to close it out. But I did not want to I wanted to end with this question and not leave it out because I think it's important. And I think I've heard bits and pieces from y'all. And so let me first, Muhammad, if you don't mind, how can religious or faith-based communities create an environment of inclusivity and belonging for LGBTQ plus individuals, not based off what you have created, but if you didn't have that and you had to go walk into this traditional type of structure, okay, and they ask you that question, what would you offer them?
Yeah, this is a really good question as well. And I've been thinking about it. I think a lot of what we as a community is looking for, we're not looking, at least I've never looked for acceptance from anyone outside of my family. And as an organizer, I don't share that knowledge with folks in a way that you need to be accepted by society. You need to be accepted by the church, the mosque, the mandir, you don't I don't it I cringe when I hear the fact that as LGBTQ people, we're navigating this world and we are constantly asking others to accept who we are, right? I like to offer a counter to that. And working with other people, we can create our own spaces. And I think in a lot of ways, we all have the tools. We know folks that can lead us, right? That we can create our own spaces where we don't necessarily need to go into traditional faith-based spaces to worship, to pray, to find community. Our community already exists. We just have to
Absolutely.
tap into our community. And I say all of that to say, because I do also work with other faith-based spaces. For example, in 2015 and 2016, to be particular, Caribbean Equality Project petitioned the Pagwa Parade organizer in New York City. And for folks who are not familiar with the word Pagwa, it's holy and it's a Hindu celebration. And there's a huge parade in Richmond Hill, Queens, the largest in North America. Thousands of Hindu people go to this parade. And for 2 years, our petition was denied. We were rejected. We weren't allowed to participate. And in 2016, the Irish community allowed its first LGBTQ group to participate in the Irish parade. And I said to the organizers, you all know LGBTQ Hindu folks exist. You call on the community to dance and celebrate in the mandirs. You call on them to pray with you. You call on them to decorate all of the murtis that are in the mandirs, but you won't create a space for them to be visible in the parade that is meant to celebrate who they are. And if the Irish community can allow an LGBTQ group to participate in that parade, you can also stand for fairness and equality through Hinduism. And in 2016, they allowed the Caribbean Equality Project to participate in that Pagwa parade. And I never knew how significant it would become until folks from the Caribbean started to reach out and say, oh my God, I never imagined that LGBTQ people could be visible in a Pagwa space, celebrating Holi. And Holi is celebrating in Guyana, Trinidad, Jamaica, wherever Indo-Caribbean people, Indo-Caribbean Hindu folks coexist and live, Holi is celebrated there. And today, we now lead what is called a Pagwa Social Justice Collective. We have been co-opting faith-based spaces through a social justice lens, addressing issues from gender-based violence to LGBTQ discrimination, sexual violence. This is what the work that I do with Caribbean Equality Project has led to, where faith-based is not just about us coming and worship in a space, it can also be about talking about social justice, human rights, reproductive justice issues as well. So in a lot of ways, we have revert and co-op a lot of faith spaces that have traditionally excluded LGBTQ people.
Wow. Thank you so much. I'm going to offer Angeline to respond to that same question on how can religious or faith-based communities create an environment of inclusivity and belonging for the LGBT plus community. And then we're going to open it up to our audience.
That I think I agree with everything Mohammed has said.
Yes.
And I think that additionally, particularly, so there are the ways that we connect with our spirituality outside of established religion, and that is so important when we can't find those spaces within. But for the spaces that we can find within, for people of faith who want to make that space in our communities, there are many things we can do, starting off with it's a tool. We're starting with two things, and those two things are to really develop a practice of welcoming and to start to educate ourselves in our community. So that's the inner work that we need to do inside before we tell anybody outside, hey, come join us. When we've done some of that inside work to get to a point where it feels like, okay, we won't do any harm when we invite people into this space, then we can put a banner outside. So a lot of UU churches have gone through programs like the Welcoming Congregation program that helps to make the congregation be prepared to welcome LGBTQ people. And that is a program that many congregations take on. And I know that that exists in many different faith communities. And I know UUs don't hold on to that by themselves. So if there are people of other traditions that want to engage that, it is available on the UUA's website. And then after that inner we community work has happened, then we can actually go outside and say, participate in Pride events, even if it's just to have a tent at Pride or walk in the parade or to put up an LGBTQ flag, preferably the progress flag on our buildings, if that's something that we can do, you know? So there are multiple steps that we can take to get to that point. And one of the other things for me is I wear this collar. I don't wear it every Sunday, but some Sundays I wear this. Other times I may wear a pride flag as a pin on my shirt. So I'm talking about the issues, making that a normative part of worship. Because sometimes our churches just do LGBT things during Pride Month, and being LGBTQ is more than Pride Month. And so finding ways to pull that experience, that reality into the rest of our daily and regular church life cycle. So in our work, preparing ourselves to welcome new people, to welcome LGBTQ folks through multiple different practices. There are many resources, but also when we are ready and we feel like we won't be doing harm, then we can put something out there that says, hey, we are here and we're ready to welcome you. We want to welcome you. Please come.
Thank you so much. And just want to let the audience know that Mohammed and Angeline have put contact information if you want to remain in touch with them. So please visit over to the chat. So I can take up to possibly 3 questions. Let me change my view. I see one hand. If you will use your emoji on your Zoom, first come, first serve. And I see Bennett. If you want to unmute yourself, if I mispronounce your name, I do apologize. If you will give us your question and or comment.
Is that me? Sorry.
That will be you.
Okay, thank you very much. Good evening. I just wanted to really agree with what Mohammed said in terms of creating, your own spaces. I think when you look at the emergence of the Rastafarian community within the Caribbean, that is what prompted the creating the absence of of young persons who had different thoughts from the political structures that existed during the colonial times, brought forward the formation of the Rastafarian movement. And so I totally agree with him when he said that, the community needs to create their own space. I mean, in St. Lucia in 2014, that is when the Rastafarian community, they actually got legal recognition of marriage. That was not there before. So when the spaces are not available, you need to be able to create those own spaces. If you look at in 2004, in St. Lucia was when Obia was decriminalized. So a lot again, these spaces are not created in these spaces that currently exist are not created for people who have different thoughts or diverse thoughts. Persons have spent thousands of years creating those systems. So it is now the change to create new systems to facilitate new thinking. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I want to make sure that I understand in the chat. Samuel, did you have a question or a comment? Okay. Are there any other questions or comments?
I have a comment.
Okay, please talk to us.
Jay from One Love, US Virgin Islands. So I wanted to say something in the chat, but it's just so much to say. We was talking about Leviticus and stuff like that. For me, I went through the laws of Moses and I realized there's a lot of contradictions in it. Plus, there are laws in there that oppress Black people, like laws that was used by colonizers to basically enslave us. Like first it would say love your neighbors, don't hate your neighbors. Then it would say you gotta hate this group of people. You have to hate a false prophet. First it would say ignore the false prophet, then it would say hate the false prophet. So for me on my religious journey, once I started seeing those contradictions, I was like, you know what? Something is wrong here, because in one sense you can't say God is a merciful God and then say God is a vengeance God, God is a hating God, God is commanding us to harm people who are different from us. So for me, I think as LGBTQ people moving forward, we really have to ignore the things that are against human rights, not just as queer people, but as Black people, and just hold on to the things that we know are really godly and really loving. So I have a lot more to say, but that's really why I wanted to say in the chat, but it was too much to say in the chat.
Thank you so much for your comments. I'm gonna take the last one before we get back to our panelists and back to the host organization. So Miles, I see your hands up. Hi, Miles. One of our
Hi,
hosts.
everyone.
Hi.
Good evening. I am Miles from Suriname, and I wanted to say that I'm very happy about this conversation. I heard a lot of things, and I wanted to say something about the conversation about Rastafaria. I think it's very nice to hear. I never heard those stories before, and it was very surprising to me because, for example, in my country, in Suriname, and yes, of course, there's a difference in the degree of discrimination in different areas, but there is still quite a bit of work that needs to be done, for example, in my country. So it was it's making me thinking a lot of how it can happen, but it was very interesting to hear those stories. I wanted to comment on how, for example, religious organizations or communities can be more inclusive and acceptance towards the LGBT community. Example, by affirming statements from religious leaders. I have first experience of that. For example, religious leaders can publicly affirm the dignity and worth of LGBT individuals by acknowledging inherent values as members of the community. For example, a pastor might give a sermon emphasizing the importance of love and acceptance for all people, including those who identify as LGBTQ. I've had the experience where a pastor used that and he exactly used the word LGBT. It gave me a feeling of welcoming and belonging, and I never stopped going, actually. I think what would also work is counseling and support. For example, if they would provide those services to LGBTQ individuals and their families. This might involve training of counselors to be sensitive to LGBT issues and providing resources for LGBT affirming therapists. I think these are two very important things that may work in churches that already exist in, or religious organization or communities that already exist. Thanks.
Wow, Miles, thank you so much. And it's good to hear your voice again. So thank you for sharing that and bringing that into this space. So I have to move on. And I know that if there are other questions or comments, please do reach out to Daniel Daphnis with ECADE. Let us collect them. All of us will continue doing this great work and support them. So if we can answer any question, even if it's in writing. But Please visit the chat, and you, Yakub, if you could put information, if you will desire, for folks to stay in contact with you if they want to have more dialogue with you. And then I will do the same when I have the opportunity. But I do want to give our panelists one final opportunity to give us their last thoughts before we give it back over to our host organization. So, Mohammed, if I may start with you, since you're the person I see on my left of my screen, to give us your last thoughts in 90 seconds.
90 seconds. Okay. Love yourself first. Put everything, I always say love yourself first. I always say we have always existed. Don't let anyone else tell you that who we are is new. In a lot of ways, the work that I do with Caribbean Equality Project, as much as I advocate for a community of safety, I also advocate for myself within that work. This work is also about keeping all of us safe. So within all the spaces that you're a part of, don't let anyone tell you don't belong. And when they tell you don't belong, create your own.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Yakub?
So for me, my words would be different. I would tell you learn to support each other because at the end of the day, we're all we have. And at the same time, as much as most of us are out here advocating, sometimes it be your own community against you and the progress that needs to happen. And as much as sometimes that may be to a few of us, we just need to be cognizant and understand that we're dealing with human beings and that things take time, but at the same time, we always need to be proactive and always try to be inclusive in whatever approach you're trying to do. I understand that we're working with LGBTQI young persons, but also remember we have differently able persons within the LGBTQI space. And there are situations that some of us tend to be exposed to, whether it be predatory behavior, etc. Always, be there to protect the young ones who are upcoming, because at the end of the day, when they're growing up, they will look at us and say that we were tolerating some of the same things that we are trying to change. So just be mindful about how we're about doing things. But most of all, I would just like to say to everyone, keep on pushing, keep on doing the good work, and don't look at it for recognition. At the end of the day, we all know where we came from and where we are today, and we should be humble that we have reached so far, because some of us really and truly maybe would have envisioned ourselves sleeping in some coffin at this time, but God has truly given us a purpose, or I would better say a better word, the universe has given us a purpose, a fulfilling purpose, not only for ourselves, but to be impactful for the lives of other people and to really and truly be other people's guiding angel. So open your wings, fly, and congratulations. And I love you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let me run it quickly back over to Mohammed. I think you wanted to insert something really quick.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I just wanted to acknowledge that this is a very significant month for all Indo-Caribbean people, folks of Indian background. It is the month where a lot of Indians were actually trafficked to the Caribbean, starting with May 1st in Grenada, May 5th in Guyana. And this is the month that all of my ancestors came on ships to the Caribbean. So I just wanted to acknowledge that in the space as well.
Thank you so much. And then Angeline, we're gonna hear your thoughts.
So my last thoughts will be in response to Jay, and it's kind of, it expands beyond. I think it was Jay was our second speaker. We don't have to be limited to what is presented to us as to find spaces of spirituality and spiritual nourishment. You can take, we can take the Bible at face value as it is. We can take pieces off the Bible and make it make sense for us. We don't have to take any of the Bible if that doesn't make sense. That is perfectly fine. There are a range of spiritual communities that we can find affirmation and support and nourishment in. It does not have to be, it can be Christian, it could be Muslim, it could be something else, totally. As Muhammad said, you can make it up, right? I think part of Unitarian Universalism is we kind of make it up as we go along and just finding the spaces that work for us and that feel good in community and being respectful of the traditions that we're pulling from. So I want to encourage us to not be confined to what exists, but to allow ourselves to recognize the expansiveness that is present. God, the divine, is more than one religion. It is more than one book, more than one building. and to see that expansiveness and to find a space of that expansiveness, even if it's in nature. So I want to affirm that we are, if this is where your spirituality is, that we are spiritual people and that we are loved in the spaces that we are right now. And there's nothing about us that needs to do anything different to receive that love that is presently right there in the universe, just waiting, already enfolding us, wrapped around us, even if we don't know that it's currently wrapped around us. So.
Thank you so much. Wow. What in your chat, give some hand clap emoji, a wow. Let's really appreciate our panelists for sharing with us on this evening. And before I relinquish my stand and give it back over to Daniel, my last thoughts accomplish all of what our panelists have shared. I will take it to my level and say that because you were created and because you are living and breathing and because you are in your truth, you are a co-creator with the divine. You're a co-creator to the God, whether that's in you or someone that has a higher power, which means that if the truth is written in your heart, you have the ability to contribute, to continue to write the sacred scriptures. You understand where I'm going, right? Find your community. Let us come together. Let us create what faith looks like for us as the LGBTQ plus community. Let's truly define them when they reject us out of a family, what an inclusive family look like. And let us prove to them that gender is a binary. So are religion and so is faith. What we practice and live out is the only authenticity, which means that you are full circle co-creating with your belief, your identity, your sexual orientation, your gender identity, because it is you. Anytime you walk out your truth, it can't be denied because you can't counsel truth, but you can counsel hate. So those are my last words. I do bid you to the abundance of the Creator that you are covered and protected, and that this webinar provides some level of education, some encouragement, some joy, and an opportunity for you to continue to dialogue within your own spirit and gain more knowledge around where you would like to be in your faith walk. So thank you so much for allowing me to moderate. It is an honor, and I'll hand it back over to Daniel Daphnis.
This conversation this evening, it was very good and very impactful. Especially hearing stories from our Caribbean siblings, because in the Caribbean, persons tend to move away from having conversations about gender identity and sexuality around religion. And because of that, the younger folks that are coming up, some of them feel like they can't be able to be their authentic self and show up in the desired faith that they wish to. So I want to say thank you to all the panelists for sharing your incredible stories and sharing how you have been coping and how you have been navigating spaces in your journey and the work that you have been doing. I also want to say thank you to our moderator, Ms. Kamarian Anderson, for taking the time to carry out this webinar for us and continue trying to understand the Caribbean root and the Caribbean struggles that we face. And I want to say extend a gratitude to everyone who took the time to be a part of this discussion by just listening and taking in whatever was shared and hear how you can navigate spaces and show up how you want to show up in terms of your beliefs and in terms of your faith. And I know that we said that this webinar was centered around commemorating International Family Equality, but I also want to say I believe this webinar, sorry, was a good start for Idaho. That is on May the 17th. We usually celebrate International Day against homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So I believe that this webinar was a good way to start towards that in terms of trying to break down discrimination and for us to continue showing up and being visible and being heard in our spaces. So let us commit ourselves to being ourselves, continue showing love to our brothers and sisters, and just be our brothers and sisters, keep it in the sense of letting them know that we can carry out whatever faith, whatever religion, whatever beliefs we wish to, and that will not define how we should be our authentic self. So let us continue, everyone here. Let us continue promoting equality, promoting love, and those kinds of things in our community to continue breaking down all those barriers that they are trying to put us in a box and marginalize us. So once again, everyone, thank you for being a part of ECADE webinar, and I do hope that you guys continue to showing up the way that you are currently doing so, and thing. Yeah. So just want to say, yeah. So just want to say good night to everyone, and do have a wonderful week and be safe. Most importantly, be yourself. Yes. Good night, everyone.